The millionaire found a woman crying in his garden, and when he asked why, he discovered that she was the mother of his child whom he never knew. The sound of the water fountain was Richard Callahan's only companion during his lonely mornings in the garden of his mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut. At 52, he had built an empire in the technology sector, but the grandeur of his 3-hectare estate only amplified the emptiness he carried. That September morning, however, something disrupted his meticulously planned routine. A woman was kneeling next to the hydrangea bushes, her back shaking in a restrained cry. Richard hesitated, his cup of artisan coffee hanging in the air. In 20 years of living there, he had never seen anyone go beyond the security gates without permission. "Excuse me," his deep voice cut through the morning air. "How did you get in here?" The woman jumped to her feet, revealing a weathered but still beautiful face framed by gray hair. Her blue eyes, brimming with tears, widened when they met his. "Richard?" Her voice shook. "You haven't changed that much." He frowned, examining her more closely. There was something vaguely familiar about her features, like a half-forgotten song. "Excuse me, but have we met?" Megan Crawford." She wiped her tears away with the back of her hand. "Boston, summer 1994. O'Malley's bar." The world seemed to spin under Richard's feet. The cup slipped from his fingers, shattering on the cobblestone path. Megan Crawford. The summer before his startup took off, when he was still just a programmer with big dreams. Megan. The name came out as a whisper. "After that summer, you just disappeared." "I had to go." Her hands intertwined nervously. "I found out something a few weeks after I left, but you'd already moved apartments. Nobody knew your new address." Richard felt his heart race. There was something in her tone, a gravity that warned him that his life was about to change irrevocably. "What did you find out, Megan?" "I was pregnant, Richard." The words fell like stones into a deep lake. "Our son, Alexander, is in Mass General Hospital. He needs a bone marrow transplant, and you—" Her voice faltered. "You're the only hope we have." The world around Richard lost focus. A son. He had a son. For 29 years, there had been a human being in the world carrying half his genes, breathing, growing, living, and he didn't know any of it. "Why now?" The words came out harsh. "Why wait so long? I tried to find you when I found out about the pregnancy. Then, when I found out about your success years later, Alex was already a teenager. He had his own life, his own struggles. She hesitated. "I didn't want him to think we were after his money." Richard staggered to a nearby bench, his legs suddenly weak. Memories of that summer in Boston flooded his mind. Warm nights, laughter in the bar, whispered plans under the stars. Megan had been more than a summer crush. She represented a time when he still believed that life could be simple and sweet. "What's he like?" The question slipped out before he could stop it. A sad smile crossed Megan's face as she grabbed her cell phone from her purse. "He has your eyes, and his obsession with solving problems." She showed a photo on the screen. Richard held his breath. The young man in the photo had her chin, her face shape. He was smiling in front of a board full of complex mathematical equations, wearing a lab coat with the MIT logo. "He's an assistant professor of theoretical physics." The pride in Megan's voice was palpable. Or he was, until his diagnosis 3 months ago. "Leukemia?" Richard asked, his mind already processing implications, possibilities, necessary actions. Megan nodded. "The doctors say he needs the transplant in the next few weeks. She took a deep breath. "I know it's a lot to process. I know I have no right to show up like this and turn his life upside down. But he's our son, Richard, and he's dying." Richard looked again at the photo on his cell phone. Alexander, his son, had his forehead, his nose. How many mornings had he spent in this same garden, feeling incomplete without knowing why? How many times had he wondered if there was anything more to life than professional success? "Give me the address of the hospital." He stood up, his voice firm for the first time since the conversation had begun. "And tell me all about it on the way." As he drove Megan to her garage, past the collection of luxury cars that now seemed so insignificant, Richard realized that his orderly, predictable life was over. In its place came something far more frightening and, paradoxically, far more precious, the chance to meet and perhaps save his son. Massachusetts General Hospital stood imposingly against the Boston sky, its windows reflecting the midday light. Richard gripped the steering wheel of his Mercedes so hard that his knuckles were white. During the 2-hour drive from Greenwich, Megan had filled the silence with stories about Alexander, his first science prize at the age of 12, how he had skipped 2 years at school, his passion for astronomy. Every word was both a gift and a stab, precious glimpses of a life he should have known from the start. "Does he know I'm coming?" Richard asked as he parked. "No." Megan nervously adjusted the strap of her bag. "I didn't want to give him false hope in case you—" She didn't finish her sentence. The elevator took them to the 6th floor, the oncology ward. Richard observed the sterile corridors, the hurried nurses, the visitors with worried looks, a completely different world from the meeting rooms where he spent his days. "Room 612, Megan indicated, stopping in front of the door. "Are you ready?" No, he wasn't. How could anyone be ready to meet an adult son they never knew existed? But Richard nodded anyway. The room was larger than the others, with a view of the Charles River. Alexander was sitting in an armchair near the window, a laptop balanced on his knees. A chemotherapy machine connected to his arm emitted soft beeps. He looked up as they entered, and Richard felt his heart stop. It was like looking at a younger version of himself. "Mom?" Alexander frowned, his gaze alternating between her and Richard. "What's going on?" "Alex, darling," Megan began, her voice trembling slightly. "This is Richard Callahan, your father." The laptop almost slipped off Alexander's knees. He grabbed it at the last second, closing it with calculated care. Richard recognized the gesture. He did it himself when he needed time to process something shocking. "My father?" Alexander's voice was controlled, analytical. "Richard Callahan from Callahan Tech? The same one who revolutionized facial recognition with quantum algorithms?" Richard blinked, surprised. "You know my work." "Your thesis on applied quantum computing was one of the reasons I became interested in theoretical physics." Alexander let out a humorless laugh. "That's surreal." A heavy silence fell over the room. Richard took a step forward, then stopped, unsure. All his experience in multi-million-dollar negotiations hadn't prepared him for this moment. "I didn't know about you," he finally said. "If I had known—" "Please," Alexander interrupted him, holding up a hand. "No family drama now. I assume my mother told you about my situation?" "Yes, and I want to help. I'll run all the necessary tests immediately." Alexander studied her face for a long moment. "Do you understand that there are no guarantees? Even if you're a match, the procedure is risky, and He hesitated. "I don't want you to feel obliged." "Alex," Richard took another step forward. "I've lost 29 years of your life. Let me try not to lose any more." Something flickered across the young teacher's face, a crack in his controlled facade. He shifted his gaze to the window, where boats were sailing peacefully down the river. "You know what's funny?" Alexander said softly. "When I was a child, I used to make up stories about you. In my head, you were a secret scientist, or an explorer lost on some important expedition. I never imagined that you would literally be changing the world with quantum technology." Richard felt his throat tighten. "And I never imagined I'd have a son bright enough to understand my work." "Well," Alexander smiled slightly. "Apparently the apple doesn't fall far from the quantum tree." A nurse entered, breaking the moment. "Dr. Crawford, time for your meds." "You're still using your mother's last name," Richard observed as the nurse checked the equipment. Alexander Callahan sounded too pretentious for a kid from suburban Boston. He shrugged, then grimaced as the nurse adjusted the access on his arm. Richard watched his son, fight the pain with dignity. How many other pains had he faced alone? How many important moments had Richard missed? "Tell me about your work at MIT, he asked, pulling up a chair. "I hear you're researching string theory." Alexander's eyes lit up, and for the next hour, father and son lost themselves in a discussion about theoretical physics and quantum possibilities. Megan watched them from the doorway, silent tears streaming down her face as she witnessed the beginning of a connection that should have existed decades ago. Neither of them noticed when she quietly left the room, leaving them to build their own bridge over the 29-year chasm that separated them. The corridors of the clinical analysis laboratory were quiet that morning. Richard watched the doctor prepare the needle for the blood draw, his mind wandering back to the intense week that had passed since he had met Alexander. Each day after that first meeting, he had returned to the hospital, canceling meetings and reorganizing his life around the visits. "This is going to sting a bit," Dr. Marcus Porter warned, inserting the needle. Richard barely felt the sting. He was too busy mentally going over his conversation with the Callahan Tech Board the night before. "I need some indefinite time off," he had announced via video conference. "Urgent family matters." The news that workaholic bachelor Richard Callahan had a sick child leaked to the press in a matter of hours. His phone hadn't stopped ringing since. "Ready," Dr. Porter announced, removing the needle. "We'll have the compatibility results in 48 hours. Richard nodded, pressing the cotton against his arm. "What if I'm not a match?" "There are other options," the doctor replied diplomatically. "But given that you're a biological father, the chances are promising." Leaving the lab, Richard met Megan in the waiting room. Over the last few days, they had developed a non-verbal routine of taking turns. While one was with Alex, the other was resting or sorting things out. "How is he today?" Richard asked. "Tired. The last chemo session was stronger." Megan hesitated. "Rachel's with him now." Richard felt his stomach turn. Rachel Chen, Alexander's fiancée, had arrived from a conference in Singapore 3 days ago. She was a brilliant astrophysicist, kind and visibly in love with Alex. She was also openly skeptical of Richard's sudden paternal intentions. "Does he hate me?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Megan stared at him in surprise. "Alex, no, he's processing, like all of us. Rachel thinks I'm only here out of guilt. Rachel is protecting the man she loves." Megan sighed. She's watched him fight leukemia for the last few months. She saw how he tried to teach even on the bad days, how he refused to let the disease define who he is. Richard closed his eyes for a moment. "He's extraordinary, Megan. You did an incredible job. We were happy, you know." She sat down on one of the plastic chairs. "Our life wasn't luxurious, but Alex never missed anything important. He had scholarships, dedicated mentors. Until he met Rachel for his doctorate, science was his one true love." "How did you cope with all this?" Richard gestured vaguely. "After I became known?" "It was complicated when your company blew up. Alex was 16 when his face started appearing in technology magazines. He would spend hours studying your interviews, your technical articles." Megan smiled sadly. "I think it was his way of getting to know you, even from a distance." The weight of guilt threatened to crush Richard. "I should have been there." "You didn't know," Megan replied softly, "and now you're here." Richard's cell phone vibrated, another reporter wanting to comment on the story. He ignored the call. "I'm going up to see him," he said, getting up. "Richard," Megan called him. "He's got his TED conference presentation saved on his laptop, all of them." Something warm and painful expanded in Richard's chest as he climbed to the 6th floor. Approaching room 612, he heard voices. "You don't have to pretend you're fine all the time," Rachel said softly. "Not with me." "I'm not pretending," Alexander's voice was hoarse. "I'm just trying to understand how my life turned into a reality TV show overnight. No one would blame you if you wanted to distance yourself from the whole situation. He's brilliant, Rach. Yesterday we spent 2 hours discussing the possibility of using quantum computing to model black holes. For the first time, I found someone who not only follows my reasoning, but challenges it, expands it. Alex. And there's more. I look at him and see parts of myself that I never understood. The way I organize my ideas, how I solve problems, even some mannerisms. It's like finding pieces of a puzzle that I didn't even know was incomplete." Richard leaned against the corridor wall, his heart beating painfully. Inside the room, Rachel sighed. "I just don't want you to get hurt. If he's not a match, or if after the transplant he—" "I know the risks," Alexander interrupted her gently. "But for the first time since the diagnosis, I feel like I have more to gain than to lose." Richard cleared his throat and knocked on the door before entering. Alexander was back in bed, paler than usual, with Rachel holding his hand. An open laptop showed a paused presentation. Richard recognized his own image on the TED stage. "Hey," Alexander smiled weakly. "Come to compare needle scars?" "Actually," Richard replied, pulling up a chair, "I came to ask your opinion on a theory I was developing, if you'd be willing to be my unofficial reviewer." Alexander's eyes sparkled with interest, and even Rachel couldn't hold back a small smile. As father and son plunged into another scientific discussion, no one mentioned the unshed tears in both their eyes, or the precious time slipping through their fingers as they waited for the results that could change everything, or nothing. Dr. Porter held the test results in his hands, his face maintaining the professional neutrality that years of practice had perfected. Richard, Megan, Rachel, and Alexander, the latter in his wheelchair, formed a tense audience in his office. "The results show an 80% match," the doctor finally announced. The air left the room as if an airplane door had been opened mid-flight. Rachel squeezed Alexander's shoulder. Megan covered her mouth with her hands. Richard remained perfectly still. "Is that enough?" Alexander's voice was firm, scientific. "It's more than enough," Dr. Porter confirmed. "In fact, it's an exceptionally good match. We can schedule the transplant for next week, after a final round of chemotherapy to prepare his system." "What are the risks for Richard?" Rachel asked, her usual diffidence momentarily replaced by genuine concern. "Marrow donation is a safe procedure. Moderate discomfort for a few days, maybe a week. Nothing life-threatening." Richard finally moved, leaning forward. "When can we start?" "Dad," Alexander said softly. It was the first time he'd used the word, and it struck like a bolt of lightning in the office. "You don't have to—" "Alex," Richard interrupted him. "Please, let me do this." Dr. Porter sniffed. "We need to discuss the pre-transplant protocol. Alexander will need intensive chemotherapy to eliminate his current marrow. It will be the most vulnerable time of the treatment." The next 2 hours were filled with medical explanations, forms, and planning. When they finally left the office, Alexander was too exhausted to argue when Richard insisted on pushing his wheelchair. "I'll get your medication from the pharmacy," Megan announced, exchanging a meaningful glance with Rachel, who muttered something about needing to make phone calls and walked away as well. Father and son were left alone in the hospital corridor. 80%, Alexander muttered, almost to himself. The odds were in our favor from the start. "Do you believe in fate?" Richard asked, surprising himself. "I believe in mathematics, in cause and effect." Alexander tilted his head back, looking at his father. "But I have to admit, the last few days have challenged some of my most basic certainties." They entered the family room, where a nurse was already preparing the equipment for the new round of chemotherapy. Richard helped Alexander transfer to the bed, noticing how his son had lost weight over the last few weeks. "You know what's ironic," Alexander said as the nurse inserted the access into his arm. "I spent years studying the biggest questions in the universe: dark matter, vacuum energy, string theory. But none of that prepared me for—" He gestured between them. "This." "Life has an interesting way of surprising us," Richard agreed, sitting down in his usual chair. "Did you know that in my early college years, I wanted to be a musician?" Alexander raised his eyebrows. "You." "Classical piano. I had talent, according to my teachers. But then I discovered programming, and the rest is history." Richard smiled. "Your mother told me you play the violin." "I used to," Alexander corrected. "The chemo affected my fine motor skills, but it was more of a hobby than a passion." A comfortable silence settled in as the chemotherapy began to flow. Richard watched his son struggle through the initial discomfort, recognizing in his tense face the same determination he saw in the mirror every morning. "Alex," he began hesitantly, "after all this is over, after you're better, I was thinking, yes. There's a private observatory on my estate in Greenwich, state of the art. I never really used it. It was more of a bored millionaire's whim. But maybe, when you're stronger. Alexander's face lit up with an enthusiasm that the disease couldn't quench. Really? What equipment do you have there? The next few hours flew by as they discussed telescopes and research possibilities. When Megan and Rachel returned, they found father and son hunched over Alexander's laptop, planning future astronomical observations as if the cancer were only a temporary inconvenience, as if they had all the time in the world. That evening, alone in his hotel suite, Richard opened his laptop and began researching violins, the best money could buy. Because for the first time in his life, he was planning a future that didn't just involve codes and algorithms, a future that, if he was lucky, would include violin music floating around the observatory while he and his son mapped the stars together. But first, they needed to survive the next week. The operating room at Massachusetts General Hospital was a maze of sterile corridors and double doors. Richard, dressed in his blue hospital gown, watched as the medical team prepared the room for the bone marrow collection. On the other side of the hospital, he knew that Alexander was starting his last session of pre-transplant chemotherapy. Mr. Callahan, the anesthesiologist approached with a gentle smile. Are you ready? Richard nodded, lying down on the operating table. As the oxygen mask approached his face, he thought of Alexander and how the last few weeks had changed everything. Count backwards from 10, the doctor instructed. 10, 9, 8. The world went dark. Richard? Richard, are you waking up? Megan's voice penetrated the anesthetic haze. He blinked, his mouth dry as cotton. Was everything all right? Perfectly, she assured him. They managed to collect more bone marrow than necessary. In fact, Alex is receiving the first part now. Richard tried to sit up, but a sharp pain in his back stopped him. The collection points were throbbing. I need to see him. Not today, Megan was firm. You need to rest, and Alex, he's very vulnerable right now. The last chemo session was the most aggressive yet. Richard closed his eyes in frustration. Over the last few weeks, he had gotten used to spending hours in room 612, talking to Alexander about physics, technology, and gradually, about life. Each conversation was like discovering a new chapter in a fascinating book he hadn't known existed. Is Rachel with him? Yes, and she promised to keep us updated every hour. A comfortable silence settled between them. It was strange how, after so many years, there was still a familiarity there, as if time was just a variable that could be adjusted, like in the equations he and Alexander loved to discuss so much. He showed me the ring yesterday, Richard said softly. The one he bought for Rachel before her diagnosis. Megan smiled. It's beautiful, isn't it? He saved up for months. He'd planned to order it after the conference in Singapore, but then... He should order now, Richard declared, not wait. Richard, life is too short to wait for the perfect moment, Megan. We both know that better than anyone. She studied him for a moment, her eyes soft. You've changed. Having a child die tends to readjust our priorities. He's not dying, Megan said firmly. Not anymore, thanks to you. Richard tried to move again, this time more slowly. Can you help me up? I need to make a phone call. Megan helped him sit on the edge of the bed, watching as he picked up his phone. James? Yes, it's me. I need you to do something for me. That French restaurant on Beacon Hill, L'Espalier? Book it, the whole restaurant, for tomorrow night. He paused. Yes, I know my son is in hospital. That's exactly why I need the restaurant. And James? Call that decorator who did the company lobby. I want the place turned into an observatory. Stars, planets, galaxies, the whole works. No, I don't care about the cost. Just make it happen. When he hung up, Megan stared at him with an expression that was hard to read. What's wrong? Nothing, she smiled. Just thinking about how funny life is. The Richard I knew could barely afford dinner at McDonald's. The Richard you knew didn't know what he was missing, he replied softly. Megan's phone vibrated. A message from Rachel. Her expression changed as she read it. "What?" Richard asked, alarmed. "His fever's gone up. It's normal at this stage, but—" She bit her lip. "The next few days will be the hardest." Richard felt the pain in his back as something distant, insignificant. "Take me to him." "Richard, you've just come out of surgery. Please, Megan." Her voice broke slightly. "I can't just stand here while he—" She studied him for a long moment before sighing. "I'll get a wheelchair, but only 15 minutes, and you can't go into the room. Just look out the window." 15 minutes later, Richard watched through the glass as Rachel applied cold compresses to Alexander's face. Her son was paler than ever, his lips moving in words Richard couldn't hear. "He's reciting mathematical constants," Megan explained softly. "It's what he does when he's in pain. He says it helps him concentrate on something other than the discomfort." Richard pressed his hand against the glass. On the other side, Alexander opened his eyes for a moment, his gaze meeting that of his father. A small smile appeared on his lips before he closed his eyes again. "Pi is 3.14159. Richard began to recite, his voice low. "Planck's constant is 6.6260705 x 10 or 34. Beside him, Megan wiped away a silent tear as father and son, separated by glass but united by numbers and love, waited together for science to do its work. L'Espalier had been transformed into a terrestrial galaxy. Twinkling stars hung from the ceiling. Projections of nebulae danced across the walls, and each table boasted a miniature planetarium. But the restaurant remained empty, except for Richard, who was nervously adjusting the holographic projector in the center of the room. Mr. Callahan, James, his assistant, appeared in the doorway. "The hospital called. Dr. Crawford has taken a significant turn for the worse in the last hour. Dr. Chen canceled." "No," Richard interrupted, already reaching for his coat. "Keep everything exactly as it is. Keep the place booked. We'll be back when—" He didn't finish his sentence, already running to his car. Massachusetts General was on alert when he arrived. Megan was in the hallway, her hands twisting an already destroyed handkerchief. "The fever won't go away," she explained as they rushed into the room. "His body is fighting the new marrow. The doctors are—" A team of nurses rushed out of room 612, giving way to Dr. Porter. "Cytokine storm," the doctor explained quickly. "His immune system is reacting more strongly than expected to the transplanted bone marrow." "But that's normal, right?" Richard asked, his voice tense. "Is it part of the process?" "Yes and no. The reaction is expected. But the intensity—" Dr. Porter hesitated. "We're increasing the immunosuppressants, but the next 24 hours will be critical." Inside the room, Rachel held Alexander's hand, whispering something in his ear. Monitors beeped in a discordant chorus. Alexander's body trembled with fever, his lips moving in a silent mantra. "He's still—" Richard approached the bed. "Reciting constants?" Rachel shook her head. "Not anymore. Now he's trying to solve some equation about black holes. He says he has to finish before—" Her voice broke. Richard leaned over the bed. "Alex? Son? I'm here." Alexander's eyes opened with difficulty, feverish but still focused. "The equation, I can't—" "What equation?" Hawking radiation. There's something wrong with the numbers." Richard took a notepad and pen from the bedside table. "Tell me. We'll work it out together." For an hour, while doctors and nurses came and went, father and son immersed themselves in a theoretical physics problem that probably had no solution. But it wasn't about solving the equation. It was about keeping Alexander's mind focused on something other than pain, other than fear. "The time variable," Alexander muttered at one point, his voice almost a whisper. "We're assuming linearity, but what if—" "If time is recursive near the event horizon," Richard added, writing frantically. "Alex, that's brilliant." But Alexander didn't reply. His eyes had closed, and the monitors began to beep more intensely. "Alex?" Rachel stood up in alarm. "Alex?" Dr. Porter and his team burst into the room again, moving with controlled urgency. "I need you all to leave," the doctor ordered. "Now." Rachel refused to let go of Alexander's hand until a nurse gently guided her out. In the corridor, Richard held Megan when her legs went weak. "He's strong," Richard said, more to himself than to the others. "He'll make it." Time dragged on like cold honey. After what seemed like an eternity, Dr. Porter left the room. "We've managed to stabilize him," he announced. "The fever has started to break. It looks like the worst is over." Rachel collapsed into a chair, sobbing. Megan hugged Richard, who only then realized that he was shaking. "Can I—" He choked, trying to control his voice. "Can I see him?" Dr. Porter nodded. "He's asleep now. His body is finally starting to accept the marrow." Richard quietly entered the room. Alexander looked younger in his sleep. The lines of pain softened on his face. On the bedside table, the notepad still showed his latest equations, a dance of mathematical symbols that had somehow helped keep him anchored to life. "You know," Richard said softly, taking a seat beside the bed. "You've just developed a new theory about Hawking radiation while fighting a cytokine storm. I think that deserves a publication." He could have sworn he saw a small smile on Alexander's lips. Picking up his notepad, Richard began to organize the equations, expanding on the ideas his son had proposed in his feverish delirium. Because that's what fathers did, isn't it? They took their children's dreams and helped them make them real, even if they had to wait 29 years to get started. In his coat pocket, the small velvet box with the ring he had helped Rachel choose, a replacement for the one Alexander had bought earlier, now with a diamond that resembled a star, waited for the right moment. Now, at last, it seemed closer. 3 weeks after the crisis, Alexander took his first unaided steps down the hospital corridor. Rachel followed close behind, her hands ready to support him, while Richard and Megan watched with a mixture of pride and apprehension. "The results of the latest tests are promising," Dr. Porter had announced earlier. "The new bone marrow is working perfectly. If it continues like this, we can consider discharge in a week." Now, as he watched his son walk slowly back to his room, Richard realized how those 3 weeks had changed them all. Alexander's hair was starting to grow back, a light dark shade that Rachel loved to stroke. His cheeks, once hollowed out by the disease, were beginning to regain color. "I think I deserve a prize for this walk," Alexander joked, taking a seat in the armchair by the window, his favorite place in the room. "How about a surprise?" Richard suggested, exchanging a complicit glance with Rachel. "Dad," Alexander narrowed his eyes, suspicious. The word father now came out naturally, as if it had always done so. "I just need to make a quick call," Richard said, leaving the room. In the hallway, he dialed James. "Is everything ready?" "Exactly as you asked," his assistant confirmed. "The restaurant is being kept exactly as it was 3 weeks ago. The projections have been updated with the latest data from the Hubble telescope, as requested." "Perfect. We'll be there in an hour." Returning to the bedroom, Richard found Alexander showing Rachel something on his laptop. "Look," he pointed excitedly at the screen. "If we consider the curvature of space-time near the event horizon, the equations we developed during the high fever actually make sense." "You remember that?" Richard asked, surprised. "Fragments. But I found your notes, and—" Alexander smiled. "You've really developed my feverish ideas into something coherent." "Actually," Richard approached, "I submitted the paper for review in physical review letters. With your name as first author, of course." Alexander blinked, astonished. "You what?" 3 reviewers have already responded, all positive. Apparently, almost dying while solving quantum physics problems produces unique insights. Rachel laughed at her fiancé's shocked expression. "I think you've just won your walking award." "Actually," Richard snorted, "there's more, if you're feeling up for a little adventure." Half an hour later, after negotiations with Dr. Porter and promises to bring Alexander back in no more than 2 hours, they were on their way to L'Espalier. Rachel had helped Alexander into a navy blue sweater that perfectly matched his eyes, Richard's eyes, as Megan always made a point of reminding him. When they entered the restaurant, Alexander stopped at the door, dumbfounded. The place was a private planetarium, with constellations dancing across the walls and a detailed projection of the Milky Way spinning gently in the center of the room. "This is," he turned to Richard, "this is what you were planning that day." Richard nodded. "I thought it would be an appropriate setting for a certain question you've been putting off asking." Alexander looked at Rachel, who was smiling with tears in her eyes. "Did you know that?" "Your father can be quite persuasive when he wants to be," she replied softly. Richard took a small velvet box out of his pocket and handed it to Alexander. "The ring you bought was beautiful, but I thought this one would go better with an astrophysicist." When Alexander opened the box, the central diamond caught the light of the projected stars, creating its own little cosmos of reflections. "It's an untreated diamond," Richard explained, "formed by the same cosmic forces that created the stars you two study." Alexander looked at his father, then at Rachel, then back at the ring. With slightly trembling hands, still regaining his strength, he knelt down. "Rachel," his voice was hoarse with emotion, "for the last few months, you've been my universal constant. When everything else was chaos and uncertainty, your love was the only force that kept me anchored." Richard moved away discreetly, giving the couple their moment. Beside him, Megan wiped away silent tears. "They're going to be very happy," she whispered. "Yes," Richard agreed, watching his son place the ring on his future daughter-in-law's finger as artificial stars danced around them. "They will." Later, as they enjoyed a meal that the chef had prepared especially for the occasion, Alexander looked at Richard. "That observatory in Greenwich," he said casually, "is it still standing?" "Waiting for you," Richard smiled. "Actually, I've done some upgrades to the equipment, and there's a new piano in the next room." "Piano?" "I thought we could rekindle some old passions. You with your violin, me on the piano." Alexander studied his father for a moment, then smiled, that smile that was so like Richard's that it sometimes frightened everyone. "You know," he said, "I think I still have a lot to learn about you." "And me about you," Richard replied. "But now we have time." Under the artificial sky of the restaurant, father and son raised their glasses in a silent toast to the future, a future that 3 months ago, neither of them knew they needed so badly. The mansion in Greenwich was different that spring afternoon. Music floated through the gardens, the precise notes of a violin dancing with the gentle melody of a piano, creating a harmony that made the birds stop to listen. Richard smiled as his fingers glided across the piano keys, accompanying Alexander's violin in a rendition of Beethoven. 6 months after the transplant, his son had regained not only his health, but also his dexterity with the instrument. Through the window of the music room, he could see Rachel and Megan in the garden, discussing the last details of the wedding that would take place there in 2 weeks' time. The music came to an end, and Alexander put down his violin, smiling. "Not bad for a couple of scientists," he commented, taking a seat next to his father on the piano bench. "Your mother told me that you never stopped playing, even during your PhD. It was my way of relaxing when the equations became impossible." Alexander ran his fingers over the keys gently. "Now I understand where that habit came from." Richard looked at his son's profile, healthy, strong, alive. The latest tests had confirmed it. The leukemia was in complete remission. Hawking's radiation paper had been published the previous month, generating considerable buzz in the scientific community. "Did you manage to solve that last part of the theory?" Richard asked. "Almost there. Rachel suggested an interesting approach using quantum topology." Alexander smiled. "She's excited to use the observatory after her honeymoon." As if summoned by the mention, Rachel appeared in the doorway of the music room. "Alex, your mother wants your opinion on the flowers." "Since when do I know about flowers?" he protested, but he was already getting up. "Since she decided that her PhD son in theoretical physics needs to have an opinion on flower arrangements," Rachel laughed. When Alexander left, Rachel stood in the doorway, looking at Richard. "Did he tell you about MIT?" Richard nodded. The institute had offered Alexander his old position back, with the flexibility to work remotely when needed. "What about our decision to live here in Greenwich?" That was news. Richard raised his eyebrows in surprise. Alex has calculated that he can teach his classes online 3 days a week, Rachel explained. On the other 2, we make the trip to Boston. It's only an hour by train. She hesitated. Besides, there's the observatory, and you have a lot of time to recover. Richard felt something warm expand in his chest. Rachel, You saved his life, she said simply. Not just with the bone marrow. You gave him something he always wanted and never admitted he needed. She smiled. Besides, someone needs to make sure you two don't spend all your nights in that observatory discussing crazy theories about black holes. From the garden, Alexander's voice called out, Rachel, I need scientific support here. Mom's trying to convince me that white roses are too obvious. Laughing, Rachel left, leaving Richard alone with the piano and his thoughts. He played a few soft notes, remembering that day in the garden, 6 months ago, when he found Megan crying by the hydrangeas. The hydrangeas were blooming again now, their colors more vibrant than ever. Likewise, the life that had sprung from that moment of despair was richer and fuller than he could ever have imagined. The door to the music room opened again, and Alexander returned, looking slightly exasperated. Apparently, we're going to have a mixture of blue hydrangeas and white lilies, he announced, taking a seat at the piano again. Mother says it represents the union of families or something. Richard smiled. Your mother always had a special flair for symbolism. Speaking of which, Alexander took an envelope out of his pocket. I wanted to show you this before I sent it. Richard opened the envelope and found an elegant wedding invitation. His eyes filled with tears as he read it. Alexandra Rachel Chen e Alexander Richard Callahan invite you to celebrate their love. Richard, Alexander said softly. My middle name. Mom changed it on my registration last week. I thought you should know. Richard couldn't reply. Instead, he put his hands on the piano keys and began to play, not Beethoven this time, but an original melody, something he had begun to compose during the long nights in hospital. Alexander picked up his violin and, without needing sheet music, began to accompany, adding his own voice to the music. From the garden, Megan and Rachel stopped their discussion about flowers to listen. The melody floated through the afternoon air, carrying in its notes all the pain, love, loss, and redemption of the last few months. It was a song about second chances and new beginnings, about time lost and time regained, about a father and son who found each other through science, saved each other through love, and now created their own harmony. As the last note dissolved into thin air, Alexander looked at his father. I think we've finally found our universal constant, he said softly. Richard nodded, understanding. In a universe of chaotic variables and quantum uncertainties, they had found something constant, unchanging. The bond between father and son, stronger than time, deeper than space, as fundamental as the laws of physics themselves. And like any good universal constant, it was there all along, just waiting to be discovered.